Hi, I'm Josh Mackinnon, and I'm going to talk today about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, in my first speech, I talked about how I'm a history major and I love history. And one of my favorite events in history is the Cold War. I think it's a really cool period for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main reasons is that it just continues to shape our global politics today. And so, of course, I love the American side, but the Soviet Union side to me is also really fascinating, and there's a lot of cool stuff to study about the Soviet Union. But today I'm going to talk about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it coming apart, ending, and ceasing to exist. So on December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet, which was like the head council of the Soviet Union, voted to dissolve the Soviet Union entirely. There wasn't any big revolution or uprising or civil war that brought it to its end, kind of like it had begun with the Russian Civil War. It just was voted to end it completely. So of course, a once great global superpower like the Soviet Union wouldn't just decide to vote itself out of power all of a sudden. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the conditions that were around in Russia and in the surrounding countries that brought it to its conclusion. So I'm going to talk about and the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the official end of the Cold War. The beginning of the end of the Cold War happened 2 years prior with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which kind of marked the end of communist bloc tension in Europe, which is a whole nother thing I could go into, but won't. The reason the Soviet Union was dissolved is because Russia, along with Ukraine and Belarus, had opted to join a new governing body known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, which actually still exists today. And here's a map kind of the countries that are a part of it. And the reason it joined that is, I'm going to talk a little bit about different historians' perspectives and what they deem as the single most important reason for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The first historian I'm going to talk about is Michael Mandelbaum, who wrote an article called Coup de Grace in the Foreign Affairs magazine. And Mandelbaum makes the claim that Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the final general secretary of the Soviet Union, which was kind of the head position, was the main reason. And what happened was Mikhail Gorbachev instituted a bunch of more liberal progressive reforms known as perestroika and glasnost. Glasnost was like the economic policy, and perestroika was the end of media censorship, because he was trying to legitimize the Soviet Union's control over the various republics due to economic stagnation and popular uprisings had been plaguing the Soviet Union. But ultimately, these reforms kind of weakened the control that Moscow had over its vast territory. And the next historian I'm going to talk about is David Maples, who wrote a book called The Collapse of the Soviet Union. And he claims that the first Russian president elected in 1990, Boris Yeltsin, was the primary cause for the dissolution. One of the reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev had made was that popular elections were instituted in the Soviet Union. And so this politician, Boris Yeltsin, was elected president, and his one of his policy goals was to take Russia out of the Soviet Union. And now that he was president, he could accomplish that, and that's why he ultimately opted to join the Commonwealth of Independent States, which effectively ended the Soviet Union's control, which is why the Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve the Soviet Union. And the last opinion I'm going to talk about is the Attorney General for Ronald Reagan, a scholar and politician named Edwin Meese, who wrote in his memoir with Reagan, The Inside Story, that Ronald Reagan's aggressive foreign policy toward the Soviet Union is what caused its collapse. And this is an opinion I disagree with, because American presidents since the beginning of the Cold War had been aggressive towards the Soviet Union. And I think that Mises' biography is a bit self-serving and not really accurate, but I wanted to include it in there for an opinion that I disagree with as one that studies the topic. So yeah, this is my conclusion is that the Soviet Union ultimately fell because of problems in the interior, not exterior forces like the United States or like pressure from the West, but it was ultimately the popular uprisings and the some of the rebellions and reform attempts to legitimize rule because of that brought the Soviet Union down. And thank you for listening to my speech.